Hey everybody, just wanted to say hello and basically just kind of give a quick introduction. This isn't scripted or planned. Already had like 5 outtakes and we've only tried twice, so not looking good. But what I will say is this: that I'm just really excited about what the Lord's put in my mind and my wife's heart. My name's Gabriel and my wife's Melanie, and the Lord just really started on our hearts. Probably back around 2014, 2015, we just started stepping out in ministry. I was preaching, and Melanie and the girls would sing before we was back in our hometown in Alabama. And we really learned a lot through that experience. Um, and I think like that was kind of the start of this. And we just didn't know what this was, if that makes sense. We really didn't know what God was going to do with it. Or, I tried a few things myself, but just never felt right. And I'm just so thankful to have my wife here beside me. She's a godsend, and I promise you I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for her and her prayers. Um, we've been married for a good bit now. This is 2025, so 26 years of marriage, 27 years of being together. I usually mess up that part, so that's why she looked at me like that. But in all honesty, we just want to share our hearts real quick. I've been trying to do this for a while, and I get distracted with the holidays. And honestly, I'm very nervous about doing this. Putting yourself out there is a whole new level, you know, of ministry. I think. Um, I guess the best thing to do right now is just tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up the oldest of 5 kids. My dad was served in the Navy. So we moved around a lot, every 3 years or so, just how the Navy life was. And, in that process, you really only have your family that you can depend on and that you can trust. And so every time we move, you have to kind of find new friends, find new places of worship. So unfortunately, because of that, we didn't really grow up in church. So I haven't been like really churched, as they say nowadays. But we would eventually find our way to a great church home. The very first one that I can remember um, was in Jacksonville, Florida, and we got invited to a vacation Bible school, and me and my brother Thomas, we started going, and eventually that led us going to church there, and my mom and dad started going, and the Lord just really started moving in our hearts and our lives, and even though I was pretty young, I was like 6 or 7. I just remember them teaching about Jesus, and as they did it, I felt like there was a familiarity there, but I didn't really know Jesus as a person, a friend, what he was. It was just a nice man. Is what I always thought. But through Vacation Bible School, I learned about who he was and what he did for me. That he died for my sins, so that way I could have eternal life and be forgiven. And that was basically the child side of it. Wasn't I'm not sure how many Sundays passed once we started going to church, but I remember Brother McMillan was preaching about Jesus, and I just remember sitting there and I was really absorbing everything that he was saying. And I'm not sure exactly what or when happened, but towards the end of the sermon, he was closing out, and I just felt a desire in my heart I needed Jesus. Like there's really no other way to describe it. Like I recognized that I needed Jesus. And so, being like 6 or 7, I started to head out down the aisle to go down because he said, if you need Jesus, come forward. So I'm just a little kid. I'm like, okay, I need Jesus. So I went on down the aisle, and my mom, I remember her, she reached out to grab my hand because she thought I was just taking off. And I'm like, no, mom, I got to go. And so I think she recognized in that moment what happened, that the Lord was dealing with me. And so she let me go all by myself. I walked down the aisle and I went and talked to Brother McMillan. And I remember him asking me, did I know who Jesus was? Did I know why I needed him and what he did for me? And I was like, yes, sir, he died for my sins, and I want to be forgiven of my sins, and I want to be saved. And it was really that simple. It wasn't complicated. And he said, okay, as long as you know what you're doing, as long as you know who Jesus is and what you're agreeing to, then I'll pray with you and you can be saved. And I said, okay. So we said a prayer. I didn't really repeat after him. He kind of started the prayer, but then he said, okay, now from your own mouth, you say, what's on your heart. And I remember asking the Lord, say, forgive me, Lord. I know I need you. And will you live in me for the rest of my life? It's literally, that was all that was said. And man, it was just an amazing feeling of peace swept over me. And I can also say, and you can probably ask my parents, that from that day forward, I was never the same child. Like I started loving on others. I wanted to help people versus before I was always getting into trouble. Me and my brother Thomas, we were only a couple years apart, less than a couple years, and we were always getting in trouble. But after that moment, it just something changed inside of me, and I don't know how else to describe it. So that's the day. That's what I tell everybody. That was the day of my salvation. Did I understand the fullness of what God had for me then, or every aspect of it, of what He would ask of me later? No. Did I know that one day I'd be sitting here starting a mission, missions or a missionary or a ministry, or ever would preach the gospel? I had no idea. I just knew that Jesus was Lord, and I wanted Him to be the Lord of my life. So that was kind of the beginning of my, experience with the Lord. I can't say I lived life perfectly from that day forward. I still got in trouble from time to time. I was still getting, caught up, with some bad friends doing some bad things. But I always knew I never felt like God ever left me. Like my heart never felt empty again. I never had the loneliness again after that moment. Um, what would you like to share this time? Maybe your thoughts on ministry and just kind of what we've been through and about your salvation. Like, how did your walk with Jesus start?
So I have kind of an opposite um, experience in that my mom and dad, my dad was a preacher, and my mom and dad sang gospel music and they traveled. So I grew up in church. We were in church all the time. We didn't have what most people would say was a home church. Um, but we were in church all weekend. My dad would run revivals. Sometimes they would last a week, sometimes longer. Um, I come from, I guess you could say, a long line of ministers. Both of my grandfathers were pastors. Um, so my normal was being in church. Um, I was probably around 7. I think we came in from a singing one night, and I don't know if it was a Saturday, a Friday, a Sunday night, but I remember we came home and it was late, and we were getting ready for bed. And every time I closed my eyes in the bed, I just kept seeing fire. And I got up and I was crying unconsolably and was talking to my mom and dad. And I told them, I said, I'm afraid if I go to sleep, that I'm going to die and I'm going to go to hell. And so my grandparents lived next door, and my mom and dad called my grandfather, and he came down, and the 4 of us sat in the living room floor, and my grandfather talked to me, my dad talked to me, and then they told me to talk to Jesus. And I, in the middle of the living room floor, prayed and talked to Jesus, and that's when I got saved. Um, Again, I was in church all the time with mom and dad. Um, I was kind of I was kind of the odd one out at school because we were always in church doing things. So people be like, "Well, what are you doing this weekend?" And it would be like, "Well, we might be going to Georgia over here on Saturday, and we might be in Mississippi on Sunday." And they'd be like, "Oh, okay." So I never really experienced like the parties and all of that because we weren't really home for that. So I was kind of like an outsider in a way, but we were everybody wanted to be my friend, but it was because I tutored everyone. Because that's what I did. I did schoolwork and then we were in church. So I was the one everybody came to for tutoring. Um, But then as we got older, it's just, I don't know. I've just had, he's always been there. And, even when things get really bad, I just know he's always there. He's always going to walk with us through whatever we're going through. So it's been a little different experience for me as far as um, where I come from and what I've done. As far as Gabe, I grew up in the same place with the same friends, went to the same high school. I didn't move until we got married. So it's been a little bit of an opposite journey.
And we've been moving a lot.
Just the last few years.
Yeah.
So 5 or 6
what
years.
was just a quick question? What was that like? Like being at a different church almost every other Sunday, every other week. Like the good and the bad of it for you.
I mean, it was fun. Um, Seeing new places, seeing different churches. My dad would always say he was an ordained Baptist minister. Um, but we were in many different denominations. We would go into Methodist, Church of God of Prophecy, Holy Church of Christ, Baptist, Southern Baptist, Missionary Baptist, just seeing different Pentecostal, seeing how different people worshiped. Um, there's good and bad in that because you can always walk in, and even as a kid, you could feel if the spirit was there or if the spirit was stifled. There were times we would go in a place and I would look at mom and ask her how soon we could leave. And then there were the times when you didn't want to leave. And then there was churches that we went to, you know, every year for homecoming, and they felt like home. They were family. So it was interesting, but at the same time, there was always well, it would be nice if we could see the same people all the time. But that's not what my parents were called to.
And I think it's kind of interesting how God uses all the stuff that you've been through. Like I was in the Navy, my dad was in the Navy, so we moved a lot. So I always had to meet new people and learn new things. It was almost like you had to just adapt, because every state was different that we lived in. The people were different, and the customs, and it was just crazy. And Melanie, while she was in one place, she traveled to many different churches, and her dad was a preacher, and so she had that experience of neither one of us really had. I guess you could say like we had a home church, like she had a home church, but she wasn't there a lot. I never really had a home church, so I'm thankful that I had those experiences with different churches. Really thankful for that because it showed me that God is just so awesome and so wonderful that to limit Him on how you worship Him or pray to Him or sing to Him, to limit Him, to limit our ability to do that, to me, it's just wrong. So I love every aspect of, we've been to different churches since we've been married, and had some really good friendships, relationships, some that I still love today and they still love me. We never get to talk, because just time is what it is. But I think just her going to different churches and me moving a lot, I think that's why it's not been like incredibly burdensome to us to have moved the way we have. Without giving too many details, we lived in a few different places in Alabama. Um, my oldest went off to college. We moved, and then then went long after that. We got connected with a church, with Pastor Howard, and his. Before that was the gathering place, but those two things kind of went together because I met Pastor Howard first, then I went to the Gathering Place Church. That's a cool testimony. I'll share it later. I don't want to get too long in the video. But I'm just really thankful for the pastors that I've had help me along the way. I can just I'll probably forget some names, but it's just I'm just so thankful for the pastors that God's placed in my life. So I won't name like all the pastors and stuff like that, but you know who you are, and I just need to know you meant everything to me, bringing me along the way you did, and teaching me how to love God and love people, to shepherd them and that kind of stuff. And that's kind of where our heart is. Um, on the ministry side of things, I do feel called to be an evangelist, and I've had a couple of people say that about me. possibly involved in some missionary work later on down the road. But so right now, where we're at, we're going to a church local, and after a long time of not being able to go to church because we had like a lot of stuff going on with the family, so I'm really looking forward to just getting tied back in with our church family and just growing and getting to know them because we just started going there like right before Thanksgiving. Um, so, anyways, so that's kind of where we're at. That's not all the ministry that just kind of got us to this point. I think without my mom and dad, and she would probably, Melanie would say the same, without her mom and dad and having grandparents that loved us, like really loved us. And even though my family wasn't really churchy, they really were loving people. And I think that kind of helped me develop to what I am. And I know it's helped my wife. We both had to overcome some shyness just to even get on this camera. Like just being real, because God calls you out into the uncomfortable. I believe if you're too comfortable, if you haven't been um, felt a little bit of a strain, like man, I've really got to push myself to do this. Probably need to pray up, and just make sure like you're heading in the right direction. Because I know it was easy for me to not go to church and not preach for a long time. I was out of church, um, but that was the easy thing. But it wasn't really easy because I suffered in my relationship with Christ, and but with our upbringing and the way we were raised, all the moving around, we really felt led to this ministry. And one of the things that's dearest to both of our hearts is just children, and especially children with special needs. Our daughter Sierra, she was born with spina bifida, and I mean,
Hydrocephalus.
in hydrocephalus, and it was tough. It was one of the hardest things. It was the hardest thing I think I ever had to do was get that news that we were having twins, and one of the twins had a problem. Because you go from this joy like twins at first, it's like whoa, twins, yay! Everybody's so excited, and then I was like, oh, twins. That's twice the diapers, twice the everything. It's like how in the world are we gonna do this? But God was faithful. But it wasn't long. We did find out at 18 weeks, right, that Sierra has spina bifida. I think we kind of knew about hydrocephalus, but it wasn't really the thing that they talked about. So because of that, she spent a lot of times at Children's Hospital, and I'll let my wife. She knows that testimony a little bit more than me, but I just want to share that with you, and then we'll probably cut this video. We're gonna try to post at least bi-weekly. I want to do more, but right now I want to commit to at least bi-weekly once. So just stay tuned to the channel, and just there again, one of the part of our ministry is special needs. And Melanie, if you would just kind of walk a little 5-minute rundown on what we went through with Sierra. I know it's way more than that, and we'll get deeper later. But just kind of why is that one of the things we want to do in our ministry?
So I was having some issues with the twins during pregnancy, and went in for an ultrasound. And the nurse told me, she said, "Oh, okay, everything's okay. I need to get the doctor. He's going to come and talk to you." I thought it was a little off, but I didn't really think too much to it until the doctor came in and he was telling us that they had found something on one of the babies and that it looked like she had spina bifida, and they were going to start sending us to UAB Hospital in Birmingham to what they called the complications clinic. And so Gabe was at work. My sister was actually with me. And we left the doctor's office, and honestly, I was just devastated. And I called him, and I'd already called him once because they were able to go in and tell us we were having 2 girls. And I'd already called to give him the news. I was like, "Hey, we're having 2 girls." And then I called him back, and I couldn't even speak. I was crying. My sister had to take the phone, and she had to talk to him. And they sent him home from work because he was, at the time, he was working survey, and he was out surveying land. I don't even remember where. And he told his crew chief, and his crew chief called it in, and they pulled him back in and sent him home. And I remember I cried for a while, and then he looked it up on the computer because at the time I'd heard of it. My dad was actually, when I was 4, my dad was paralyzed. He was thrown from a horse. And so we had been in and out of the hospitals. Dad had lots of friends who were paralyzed and various things. So I'd heard of it, but I had no idea what it was. Gabe looked it up and then told me in no uncertain terms that I wasn't going to look at a computer. And so we started making phone calls. And first was family. And then after family, it was prayer warriors. And as we kept having, I had to go every 2 weeks to the clinic to keep an eye on Sierra. And every time they would do an ultrasound to check on her hydrocephalus, to check on her spina bifida. And every time the spot on her back was moving, because at first it was high up on her back. And the higher up it is, the worse it is. And the more it can affect. It can affect their heart, their lungs, and cause a lot of issues. And so every time we went, it was slowly going lower and lower and lower. In fact, by the time she was born, it had moved all the way from her high back to her sacral vertebrae. And so she had, it was in the best place possible, but she still had, when she was born, we were told she still had the worst form of spina bifida. She has myelomeningocele spina bifida, which means that the nerves of her spinal cord grew out into a pouch on her back. So when she was 4 days old, they had to do they had to do surgery on her, and they had to repair her spine and her back. And then when she was 8 days old, they had to put a shunt in for the hydrocephalus. So it was very difficult, and we only made it through by God's grace and his faithfulness and a lot of prayer. Because for both of her surgeries, I was still in the hospital, and Gabe had to go back and forth between 2 hospitals. So I was at UAB and she was at Children's Hospital. And so he would walk back and forth between the 2 hospitals every day. And he was there for both surgeries while I was still in the hospital because I had complications after giving birth. And so I was in the hospital for almost 2 weeks. So it was very difficult, but we were surrounded by wonderful family, friends, godly people, and we just knew that the only thing we could do was put her in God's hands.
And I think the shunt was probably the worst part of it for us. Like it kept, as her head got smaller from the swelling going down, the shunt, it's a tube really that drains the spinal fluid out of the brain and puts it back into the body so it can be reabsorbed by the spine. That's a lot in a mouthful. But it was really scary, honestly, like having to walk back and forth. And Melanie actually had lost a lot of blood. Turned out she was slightly anemic, and they did a C-section with twins. So I couldn't see her after they asked me to leave after the first part of once they removed the babies, they asked me to leave the room, and it was at least a couple hours had passed. I didn't know she was having any problems. I just know I couldn't see her. And I finally was able to see her. I just remember her looking like ghost white. And there's a whole other testimony about the C-section. I lost her multiple times. I could literally see the life just go out of her eyes. And she would wake up, and her first question was always, "How's the babies? Are they okay?" And she would pass back out. And I think they were using adrenaline, I think, to keep her heart pumping because it just wasn't a good situation. Um, I finally saw her. They gave you, 2 pints. They had to give her 2 pints of blood just to get her back situated to normal, really. And that's kind of her side of it. Again, more to that story. But I agree with her. Without the friends and family and the support system, we never would have made it through that time, and it wasn't perfect. We had arguments, but it was a stressful situation, and that happens with family, family's always going to have different ideas and opinions, and that's just something you deal with and you learn, especially when you have kids, and you add complications, it just makes it complicated. But all those relationships were great, restored, filled with love. I really just want to shout out Spina Bifida of Alabama just real quick. They kind of what put in our hearts what it was like to help families like ours. Because up to that point, we knew that they were children with disabilities, but we never had experienced that. That was like the first time. Our nephew Cody, he had cystic fibrosis, so we did deal with that some, but with the spina bifida, we never. I said deal with that. That's not a correct way. There was a lot of praying involved with Cody too, with his cystic fibrosis with her sister and stuff. But that just being in children's, because the hospital, when your child's like that, the hospital really becomes a second home to you. Because you're in there, you see the doctors really more than you see relatives. Honestly, like first and second cousins and some aunts and uncles you don't see but to the holidays, and we were seeing them, every other week. It seemed like at first until Sierra kind of got stabilized. But Spina Bifida, Alabama. What was the nurse's name? The lady there's two ladies over that Nadine, right? Was one of the nurses.
Nadine
She
was
was
her
such a
nurse
blessing.
for 15 years.
And then
Betsy Hobson.
Betsy, probably
is
don't say last name, but
amazing woman who works very tirelessly for Children's Hospital. She is the clinic coordinator for the Spina Bifida Clinic, and she is working actually for not just national but global assistance for people with spina bifida.
Yeah. And she was one of the first people I met outside of the doctors and nurses.
And the first thing she wanted to do was pray.
And the first thing she wanted to do was pray with us, and that really set us on a whole different trajectory. Because up to that point, we really had been out of church, and I know Melanie stayed faithful. I wasn't so faithful, and I'm not. That's not why Sierra was born spina bifida. I don't want anybody to think that. I know I blamed myself for a long time because I thought if I had just been going to church, if I had just prayed enough, if I had just done this or just done that, then Sierra would have been fine. But the Lord showed me. Now she's almost 17. God's just showed me throughout this time that it had nothing to do with me really. Like it was, everything. Romans 8:28. Despite what the world throws at us or the enemy throws at us, God's always going to work to our good. And I wouldn't give anything for our daughters. Oldest being Caitlin, she was like a second mom, and Sierra's twin is Alexis. She is just so funny, and both of my children are both of my twins. They're just crazy. Like they're complete opposites. And Caitlin was like a happy medium, I would say, between the twins. So she kind of Caitlin's got more of mine and my Melanie's personality, and the twins kind of separate. Like Alexis more like me, and Sierra's probably more like Melanie. but that's just our heart. We can get into other stuff later. It's getting on like 30 minutes. So if you've made it this far in the video and have not closed it out, just say amen in the comments, and feel free to share a testimony or a word of encouragement, or if you've been through something similar, we would love to pray for you. That's the number one thing for me, is praying for others, and then helping others when we have the ability to help others. So thank you so much, and we'll close it out, I guess. I hope this sounds good on the playback because we really have never done this before. So, man, all glory to God. Love you, Jesus. Go Team Jesus. And do you like anything you gotta say? You're good. All right. She loves you. She's a little shy. But just thank you so much, and God bless.